President Biden warns the U.S. will be financially impacted if Russia invades Ukraine. The burden for Americans would mainly be felt at the gas pump. White House says it's still bracing for some sort of military action from Moscow, despite the Kremlin announcing a troop pullback from the border. Weijia Jiang has the latest from Washington and joins us now from the White House. So, Weijia, what are you learning?
Good morning, Vlad and Lana. Good morning to everybody. So the Russian military says, in fact, that some troops are moving away from Ukraine and even returning to their home bases. But President Biden says the U.S. has not been able to verify that claim. In fact, the number that he mentioned, 150,000 Russian troops there on the border, is the biggest one that we have heard so far. And he added they remain in a threatening position.
We should give the diplomacy every chance to succeed.
President Biden promised to do what he could to prevent a war, something Vladimir Putin claimed he does not want during a meeting in Moscow with the German chancellor. The Russian leader said de-escalation is possible with the negotiation process through peaceful means, but Mr. Biden is not convinced.
An invasion remains distinctly possible.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is in the region, meeting with leaders in nearby Poland, Lithuania, and Belgium. The president revealed there are now more than 150,000 troops surrounding Ukraine, up from 130,000 a few days ago.
I've been clear that if Russia targets Americans in Ukraine, we will respond forcefully.
President Biden committed to securing NATO's eastern flank, but he vowed not to send American forces to fight in Ukraine, insisting the administration is ready to implement a devastating sanctions package. And Senate lawmakers say they are prepared to support those sanctions if Putin further escalates.
The Democrats think you should do a sanctions bill announcing in advance what you would do if there was an invasion.
The president warned that sanctions on Russia may hurt Americans, too.
But the American people understand that defending democracy and liberty is never without cost. I will not pretend this will be painless. There could be impact on our energy prices.
The administration is looking at a number of ways to offset the already high gas prices, and it is not ruling out the temporary pause of the gas tax. Meanwhile, Vice President Kamala Harris is heading to Germany later this week to attend the Munich Security Conference, and the White House says that really shows the U.S. commitment to NATO allies. Vlad and Lana?
Hey, Weijia. So earlier on CBS Mornings, the State Department Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Ambassador Victoria Nuland, addressed the concerns about reported cyber attacks targeting Ukraine. I want to play for our viewers some of what she said.
We're still investigating and doing forensics along with the Ukrainians. I think what's most important is that these cyber attacks were not very successful. They were both the Ministry of Defense and the banks were able to reestablish in real time, and that is a direct result of the hard work that the Ukrainians have been doing with our help to make themselves resilient. But who is best at this? Who uses this weapon all around the world? Obviously, the Kremlin.
So while the ambassador, Weijia, conceded that the investigation is ongoing into that, are there concerns that Russia or Russian agents might launch cyber attacks on the U.S. or U.S. companies as well?
There are concerns, and there have been concerns, because it was not that long ago that the U.S. experienced a string of cyber attacks that targeted some of our most critical infrastructure. And so, given the escalated tension, officials in the U.S. government certainly are constantly monitoring. In fact, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security just had a meeting with local and state partners this week, warning them to be on high alert and to be aware of the possibility. That said, officials say right now they don't have any evidence that there is a credible threat to U.S. infrastructure, but that could change in an instant. It's also important to note here that, as the Secretary just mentioned, that, the Kremlin does have the power to do much more. And so that is why, for weeks now, sources have been saying they believe a cyber attack, a massive one, could be a precursor to a military invasion. So it does not appear that this one is the capital T cyber attack that they've been watching for. But again, that could change day by day.
So, Weijia, the president, as you know, has said that he wants the United States to give diplomatic talks every chance to succeed. The question, of course, is how is the administration preparing for the worst should Russia invade Ukraine? I don't know if you caught our discussion with Senator Rick Scott. He talked about Nord Stream 2. The president has gone on the record saying he would like to end Nord Stream 2. He would push for that if the Russians invade. But how could he possibly do it? There's some question as how exactly he would do it.
And that's really important, Vlad, because when it comes to that particular pipeline, the president does not have the power to do so. He has to continue pressuring Germany, which he has done. In fact, the chancellor was just here at the White House last week, and it was really notable that the president stood next to him and said, if Russia invades, then that project will be off the table. However, the chancellor, even though he was standing right there, did not reiterate that. He did say that the two countries were on the same page, but it was really glaring that the chancellor did not take the same opportunity to explicitly say that that would no longer move forward, which would be extremely detrimental to Russia. And so we have to see. Obviously, Germany has to weigh its impact as well for its economy. There are other ways that the administration has been preparing. We've been talking about this sanctions package that it would like to implement. And also, we have learned that the National Security Council has been working with a so-called Tiger team to go over every scenario that they can think of, every intelligence assessment with the right players so that the U.S. is ready to respond and move as soon as there is an invasion. And so there is a playbook. They've worked with officials as high as members of the cabinet to practice these exercises, to look at what would be missing, so they know how to respond. But Vlad and Lana, it's really important to note that yesterday, President Biden, even though he said that there would be immediate action, he also said that there would not be U.S. boots on the ground when it came to fighting this war. The U.S. is committed to beefing up the NATO's eastern flank and protecting our allies, but he did stress once again that he would not be sending servicemen into a war if it unfolds.
All right, Weijia Jiang for us at the White House. Weijia, as always, we thank you.
Sure.